So moving on, we have the second presentation of this blog, which is by Adam Amrani, and it's titled Psychedelics and Dissociation at the Crossroads. So Adam is an aspiring psychotherapist completing his master's degree in clinical psychology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And beside his training, he works as an intern in psychiatry research unit dedicated to psychedelic research, where he is conducting his first study. Adam is also the co-founder of PALA, which is the Psychedelics Association of Lausanne for Awareness, which is the first academic student society of its kind in Switzerland. Welcome, Adam. We're going to spotlight you soon. It's great to have you. And we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Is it fine like this? Are you seeing? Can you hear me actually?
Yes, all good.
Yeah. All right. All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be able to talk about this subject that is very dear to me. So let's get started. If it works. Yeah. So dissociation is a single word that covers a wide array of phenomena, ranging from selective attention and daydreaming to multiple separated selves within one person. And so it's quite a broad term, and to this day, we still lack a clear terminology to distinguish between the different processes associated to this word. And so in this presentation, we're going to stick with the clinical definition of dissociation as a subjective loss of integration of information or control over mental processes that, under normal circumstances, are available to conscious awareness or control, including memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. And so several dissociation models emerged throughout the years, like the internal family systems theory that you should definitely check out. But one theory which has been getting a lot of traction in the past years is the theory of structural dissociation of the personality that was introduced by Onno van der Hart in 2005. And according to this model, trauma, so an adverse experience that is too overwhelming to be integrated, will induce a split between what he calls an emotional part, or EP, and an apparently normal part, or ANP. And so the EP, or emotional part, holds the traumatic content, like memories, sensations, reactions related to the initial trauma. And that actually allows the ANP to overcome the trauma and keep living and managing daily life while being protected from the traumatic content. And what's interesting about this theory is that there are three levels of structural dissociation. The primary level can be used to describe simple PTSD, for example, where after a traumatic event, one EP is split from the ANP. Then there is a secondary dissociation where you actually have multiple EPs with only one ANP, and you can see that in complex PTSD cases. And finally, you have tertiary dissociation, which is the most severe, where you have multiple EPs and several ANPs or managers that manage different parts of the person's life, like working life, social life, or sex life. And what's interesting is that there can be diverse levels of connection and access between the parts. And in the most extreme forms, like DID, or Dissociative Identity Disorder, different parts can be fully unaware of each other, with them having different self-representations, like different names, genders, ages, body images, taste, or even reaction to medication. So it can go pretty far. And this theory categorizes positive and negative symptoms of dissociation by distinguishing between psychological symptoms and somatic symptoms. And so for positive symptoms, the psychologic positive symptoms, you have intrusive emotions, hearing voices, flashbacks, or the infamous switches that you can see in DID or partial DID. And on the somatic side, you can have involuntary movements, intrusive sensations, or unexplained localized pain. And for the negative psychologic symptoms, you find things like amnesia, excessive spacing out, anhedonia, depersonalization, derealization. And on the negative side, and on the somatic side, you have analgesia, motor inhibition, and conversion disorders as well, like, for example, losing eyesight or losing the ability to move some body parts without any neurological damage. And so that's also dissociative symptoms. And to properly understand dissociative disorders, we have really to distinguish between simple PTSD and the complex PTSD and the more extreme form, that is the DID. And the issue is really chronic stress and chronic trauma. So for PTSD, as you're experiencing a traumatic event at a given moment in life, different coping mechanisms can emerge, like the fight, flight, freeze responses, and you usually get back to security after the event. While in complex PTSD or DID, there is no escape. Like trauma keeps happening and you cannot escape nor fight. And so you have to accommodate yourself with the situation. And so usually what happens, it's a caregiver abusing a child or a human trafficking victim. And in that case, only the freeze response is available. Basically, you escape and you flee inside repeatedly. And so the frozen and traumatized parts get frozen in time away from awareness, and to protect the ANP or ANPs for them to be able to live and proceed with life. And so for both PTSD and complex PTSD, you find avoidance of memories and neurophysiological alterations. But for complex PTSD, the avoidance of memories can be really phobic, with even some parts that can emerge to drive the NP away from the emotional part and its content, and engaging in self-destructive behavior. So it can get quite extreme. And also in PTSD, there are neurophysiological alterations, but in complex PTSD and DID, it's really the whole development of the brain that embeds itself around the threat and the freeze response. And that comes with significant structural alterations, like an overgrown amygdala, an atrophied hippocampus, and the corpus callosum as well, which prevents proper communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. And so there is also the issue of disorganized traumatic attachment for chronic trauma cases that stems from highly contradictory emotional inputs from a caregiver usually. And so the child goes and seeks love and security from a figure, while at the same time being violently threatened by it. And so that messes up with interpersonal relationships big time. And so in order to integrate and overcome such situations for the more severe forms of trauma-induced dissociation, you have to overcome hardwired neurophysiological responses to be able to diffuse those emergency reaction states, like the fight, flight, freeze responses. And the goal is to attain what Janina Fisher calls this window of tolerance, in which one can integrate and learn new processing pathways. And so in that sense, the therapist can be seen as a neurological regulator. And one important aspect that allow for such regulation is narrative restructurations, because most chronically traumatized people, as you may know, are very self-hating and lacking a coherent and compassionate narrative framework to make sense of their situation. And so psychoeducation is key to foster the curiosity and self-compassion for them and their parts in order for them to be able to explore. And a second important element is the tolerance for inner conflict. And with the help of a strong therapeutic alliance, the patient can gradually begin to tolerate that inner conflict, and what we might call co-consciousness. So having two contradictory parts being there at the same time and aware of each other. And so that's the goal. Like the goal is to aim for this co-consciousness in that window of tolerance, so that different parts can communicate and recognize each other and integrate ultimately. And there are a bunch of methods that exist to help a patient get there, but keep in mind that approaching severe chronic trauma is not the same as simple PTSD or other disorders. because we are not going to engage in systematic desensitization and in vivo exposures, because the traumatic content can be too extreme to be faced directly. So even if it's important that they know what happened to them, focus needs really to be put on the physiological, emotional, cognitive effects of the traumatic background. And that's why psychocorporal approaches, for example, are quite helpful in helping a patient regulate in the here and now. And so I think you know where this is going. So what about psychedelic therapy? So you may know Michael Mithoefer, that is a clinical investigator for MAPS that supervised the MDMA sessions in the clinical, the second phase of the clinical trial for PTSD treatment with MDMA. And so in his work, he observed what follows. So he said that in our experience, MDMA in a therapeutic setting often raises awareness of different parts of the psyche and simultaneously brings forth more self-energy to allow exploration of the parts with greater compassion and clarity. And he adds that participants have spontaneously brought up their awareness of different parts of themselves in 81% of the MDMA sessions. And a greater understanding and acceptance of these parts have often been important elements in the therapeutic process. So that's really a huge number, like 81%. And so we already know about the potential of MDMA to treat PTSD. So what about the more severe dissociative disorders like DID and severe complex PTSD? Well, actually, it could be even more impressive for such patients, thanks still to this specific effect of MDMA on the amygdala and its communication with the hippocampus, amongst other effects. And we are not talking about a corrective experience in a brain that got stuck in a traumatic response like in PTSD. Instead, we're like talking about overcoming an embedded traumatic hierarchy that molded the brain throughout the years and decades. And that could allow for a unique experience of secure self-exploration, even if it can be a quite challenging process. And so there is surely promising venues in that regard. And I won't be talking about other psychedelics like ayahuasca that could also be promising because we don't have much time. But keep in mind that, yeah, the specific alarm tempering action of MDMA is truly key to address severe trauma. But there is a but. The thing is that it can be very risky for the more extreme types of patients. And one reason for that is that getting to know a dissociated system can take years, and a lot of work is required for that. Also, the system can change dramatically, and so it's difficult to assess the readiness of such a patient to undergo psychedelic therapy. There's also the issue of traumatic attachment that can make the therapeutic alliance unstable, and we cannot take the chance of becoming a threatening figure for the patient during a psychedelic experience. There's also the fact that those patients are particularly vulnerable and have few resources to integrate, and so the boundaries are there for a reason, and there is a considerable risk in taking them down. And finally, we currently don't have enough collective experience in helping such patients, and we also don't have enough experience in psychedelic therapy, as setting and therapist competencies have to be ideal for us to suggest such therapies to the most extreme patients. Like we really have a long way to go before we can do that, I believe. So then why should we investigate dissociation and its link with psychedelics, and especially regarding severe dissociative disorders? First reason is that we need to clarify concepts, because there is a huge problem of false diagnosis happening right now with the ID patient being diagnosed as schizophrenics and put under a neuroleptic medication, which is really bad. And that there is also some therapists that don't even believe their patients regarding the extent to which their memories can be extreme and their identity switches. And so that's definitely a big problem. And there is also the fact that the DSM-5 doesn't recognize complex PTSD or the specificities of chronic stress. And so despite that, it recognizes dissociative disorders as they have their own category, but those diagnoses are very broad, as you can read. are not quite helpful actually in the treatment. So there is really a lot of work to do in that area. A second reason would be that studying dissociation could help us frame psychedelic therapy as well, because dissociative symptoms often emerge in psychedelic sessions with all types of patients. And having a coherent framework to understand trauma and dissociation is important for the preparation and the integration of such experiences if they occur. And so we would have a lot to gain from addressing and understanding those dissociative processes in depth. And that's why I believe that there are some very promising venues for psychedelic research in relationship with dissociative processes, because that could help us understand them, distinguish them, could also help us understand some psychedelic effects, be it on the neurological aspect or the phenomenological aspect. And as you can see, like the sense of self is quite different and peculiar in dissociative disorders, and so that can also help us understand more about consciousness and our sense of self. And last but not least, patients need it big time, because few therapists are of help. Those patients lead very difficult lives with a lot of loneliness, lots of suffering, and they often have little awareness or possibility to talk about their situation, and the world is not ready to look at what happened to them. We are talking about some types of abuses that can be quite unimaginable, like happening to like group abuses that happen to children that are under 2 years old for 10 years. Like it's difficult to fathom the extent to which those traumatic events can go. And so for that reason as well, I believe that our societies need for us to investigate this, because we live in a world where chronic stress and trauma is omnipresent. And I believe that seeing our societal systems through the lens of trauma and dissociation can be very helpful for us to understand how we got there, the different perspectives and positions in play, and how to find pragmatical solutions for us to become a more integrated and aware world. So that's it for me. I hope I was not too quick, because there was a lot to cover. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Oh wow, look at that. I have way too many questions myself, and I think after hearing about your interest in dissociation linked to psychedelics, I got interested myself as well. But I'm gonna give you a couple of questions from the audience first, and then one from me. Okay, so Lucia Maria is thanking you for the presentation, and she's curious about BPD patients who experience dissociative symptoms. Can we risk to study them under psychedelic treatment?
Could we risk? I don't really know about the risk aspect, but it's definitely something to do, because also Janina Fischer, for example, and other authors highlight the fact that dissociative processes, traumatic dissociative processes, are at the basis of other disorders like BPD, and that there's a lot of overlapping symptoms that you can find in some dissociative disorders and the BPD. And so you could argue that BPD is a dissociative disorder of some sort. And so studying them and studying this particular diagnosed category could really be helpful to help clarify once again those concepts and find the overlapping and distinguishable elements of that. So definitely interesting, yes.
Oh, thank you. And Julian is asking whether or why are other psychedelics not or less suitable for treating PTSD, if you have something to say to that.
Well, it's really about this specific action on the amygdala. So I'm not a neuroscience guy, kind of an amateur, so I'm going to try, but it's really about the fact that MDMA has this specific action on the amygdala that really tempers down the alarm response, which brings people into that state of emergency, and that can make the matter much worse and make them dissociate further rather than integrate. And so MDMA really has this safety net that makes it suitable for this kind of work. Other psychedelics could work as well, but maybe you're flipping a coin there, especially for the most extreme patients. Like it can really go bad. So you really have to be careful. But I think there is something with ayahuasca that could be very interesting, especially regarding the somatic aspect and let's say the embodiment aspect of dissociation. And so I don't think that MDMA is the only candidate here, but at least in the first, maybe after a few years of therapy, you could imagine going to another substance after MDMA, but I think you cannot really start by something else.
Yeah. So in a sense, I also understand why it's easier in a sense to start from PTSD before you even move into complex PTSD or DID, because those are severe cases. I mean, everything is a severe case, but it's complex. Okay, and one last question from me. I was very curious with that graph you pulled out about flight or freeze response, how you showed the zone in the middle. And I know that in your background, you do see patients and you know basically how they operate in response to trauma. And I'm curious if you ever see different responses, people operating on all the different fight, flight, or freeze responses, not just one specific, and can hardly bring themselves. I mean, I think that's common, but I wonder if it's common to have all kinds of these responses.
Yeah, well, I can give an example of that. Maybe so I followed one patient for about 25 sessions, and he was toxicomanic patient, heroin addict, borderline personality disorder, but super high on the spectrum, super traumatized and whatever. And so in two different occasions, maybe two successive sessions, there is one time that for the first time he had for the first time he was contemplating the idea of being able to forgive himself for things he did. And after he said that for the first time, he snapped out and he kind of dissociated, if you will, and he forgot what he was talking about. And he said, that was not me. And he just forgot what he was talking about. And so I had to get back on that. So that was interesting. And at one point he disclosed the session before, I think he disclosed another trauma that he never really talked about. And as he was trying to talk about that, he really started shaking and he started sweating, and he really was in this hyper aroused mode. And so with this patient, I think I saw the whole array of responses, and so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but obviously that's yeah, usually you are all over the place,
Wow, and the things you're gonna see as a practitioner, huh? Thanks, Adam. Thanks so much for the presentation.
Thank you. It was really, really cool having this opportunity.